Президент тут. Всі ми тут, наші військові тут, громадяни суспільства тут, всі ми тут. Захищаємо нашу незалежність, нашу державу. І так буде й далі. Слава нашим захисникам, слава нашим захисницям. Слава Україні!
Героям слава!
It's Friday, March the 4th, and welcome back to GoodFellows, a Hoover Institution broadcast exploring social, economic, political, and in this case, geopolitical concerns. I'm Bill Whalen. I'm a Hoover Distinguished Policy Fellow. I'll be your moderator today. Glad to report that I'm joined, as always, by the stars of our show, three of my colleagues we jokingly refer to as the GoodFellows. That would be the historian Niall Ferguson, the economist John Cochrane, the geostrategist Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. They are Hoover Institution senior fellows all. So, John, we're going to do a truncated version of GoodFellows today because we're going to pick up the same topic in just a few days. And obviously, we're going to talk about Ukraine and the various ramifications. HR, let's start with you. I want to talk about the military side of the equation. We are, all four of us, children of the Cold War, during which we were taught to fear and revere the Russian fighting machine, Russian military might. What we've seen in the Ukraine, though, suggests something different. Reports of Russian soldiers who didn't know they were actually invading Ukraine, Russian soldiers who said they didn't want to fight, stories of Russian machinery breaking down, questions of strategy, supply chains that don't work, a shock and awe strategy that's now in day 9 of fighting. HR, is the Russian military, is it sclerotic like other aspects of Russian society? What's going on here?
Hey, Bill, it is sclerotic. And what you're talking about are really the human and qualitative dimensions of combat effectiveness. And what I see are formations who are not well trained. I mean, they're not conducting effective combined arms operations, especially in close combat, right? And but this is not to say they're not dangerous, because as we've seen from Kharkiv, they can still apply fires massively and indiscriminately. So I think what we've seen is a force that wasn't prepared for this because they thought it would be easy. They thought that the Ukrainians would fold. They came into this operation with all the wrong assumptions and some of the critical competencies that make actually, waging war pretty darn difficult. They looked at they're very deficient on, and I would include logistics in that connection, as well as combined arms and joint operations, the ability to apply, firepower across all domains, the aerospace domain and so forth, and use artillery, and then to be able to maneuver effectively, conducting fire and maneuver. And of course, what you're seeing is they're lined up on roads in large measure because, Putin did Xi Jinping a solid, and said, okay, hey, I'll delay my invasion till after the Olympics. Well, the ground thawed, and so now they're dealing with this really difficult situation where, how much of that combat power is usable when you're driving down a road? Well, maybe the first couple of tanks. And then the rest of it is not usable in terms of fire and maneuver. So they have some real tactical constraints. And now, Bill, once they get into urban areas, that's the most difficult military problem you can face in close combat. So I think they're not up to it, Bill. And I think they're going to fail if their effort is, as we saw just in recent days, if their mission is to take over all of Ukraine and control it. I don't think there's any way that happens.
Mm-hmm. Do you think they fail? They seem to be turning to World War II tactics, to unguided munitions, just destroy everything in your path. Can we count on the Ukrainians holding out, and for how long if they turn to those kinds of tactics?
Well, they'll fail at a horrible cost inflicted on Russians, but especially on Ukrainians. And I think, the analogy is what they did in Chechnya, in the mid 1990s and in 1999, especially when they met resistance in Chechnya and Grozny, 4,000 fighters, right, who just had small arms, essentially, inflicted tremendous losses on the Russians. What did they do? They leveled the city and killed 80,000 civilians, right? So, this is not to say it's in any way going to be anything but a catastrophe for the Ukrainians. But in terms of what Putin wanted out of this, which was to put in a puppet government, control all of Ukraine, and extend his authority, across Ukraine, I don't see that happening.
Where do you see this going militarily?
Where it goes militarily is continued losses inflicted on the Russians. And when is the point when the Russians really tried to circumscribe their objectives? Is it Kyiv only, and then east of the Dnieper River? And of course, this isn't good for Ukrainians, right? Because what they'll do is keep the rest of Ukraine under their thumb and under constant threat. But there has to be a time at which the Russians realize they can't do what they set out to do at the outset. And then what happens in terms of negotiations, international pressure on Russia, how this plays out in the long term? Can we demand safe passage for humanitarian relief? The next 8 days, 9 days or so are going to be important. We're going to know a lot more, obviously, because that's when I think the plight of the Ukrainian people in areas that Russia has cut off is going to become quite desperate. It's going to be a desperate situation, and I think we just don't know. I mean, it's one of the aspects of war, because of its interactive nature and because of the complex causality of events and outcomes in war. I don't think any of us can predict with any degree of certainty what's going to happen next and how this is going to evolve.
I want to endorse that. Anybody who tells you with confidence that they know Russia's going to fail really is bluffing, because there is a scenario in which, after all, this has only been going on for just over a week. In the next week or 2 weeks, they inflict sufficient damage to take out Ukraine's capacity to defend itself, other than through an insurgency. In other words, they win, but it's a Pyrrhic victory. But there's another scenario in which they're actually unable to defeat Ukraine's forces, and the war then grinds into a brutal stalemate. But nobody can be certain about that. And I hear radically different assessments from people with vastly more military experience than me. But there's more to this story than just the fighting. And this is where Professor Cochrane comes in, because we decided we weren't going to get involved. The only thing we were going to do was to impose sanctions. That didn't work as a deterrent, but now we are enforcing sanctions far tougher than we've seen in many, many years. I mean, this is almost like the sanctions that we imposed on Germany at the outbreak of World War I. So the other thing that is really hard to answer is, at what point do these sanctions on Russia's economy actually impact the Russian army's ability to keep fighting? That takes a while, because they probably have sufficient ammunition, and Russia is not about to run out of gasoline. But there is unquestionably a huge economic shock being administered to Russia by these sanctions. And I'm not sure that we've thought through the consequences of doing this, because one possible scenario, which I'd give a 10% probability, is that Putin actually is overthrown in a palace coup, not a revolution. That's something that's happened in Russian history before. If you're failing at war, you're likely to be out. And I think, again, nobody knows with any confidence if there's going to be a dramatic change in the domestic situation in Russia. One last variable: what about the diplomatic moves that the Chinese may make? They've already signaled openness to being the peace brokers. That would be a sweet win for them. After all, they really have the leverage over Putin now. Without Chinese backing, his economy is in total freefall. So one scenario, and again, nobody really knows, is that we suddenly discover there's enough of a stalemate on the battlefield that Putin has to take an off-ramp, but it's offered by Beijing. Now, I was right in predicting this war. I consistently said war was coming from the very beginning of the year. I find it much harder to predict what is going to happen in each of these four domains. And that's where I need you, John. This looks like a massive shock to Russia's economy. Can you give us a sense of what massive means?
Yes, it's big. Now, it is part of what I find shocking, the lack of long-run strategy on our part. You said quite rightly, sanctions are a threat intended as a deterrent. Don't do this or else we're going to hurt you. Now we are turning to sanctions as a warfighting strategy. And usually the standard wisdom is, you'll tell me from history, sanctions don't work as a warfighting strategy. They're part of what you do in a war. Yes, we cut off trade with Germany in World War I and World War II. But sanctions alone, common wisdom goes, doesn't cause a dictator to turn around, relinquish conquered territory. Look at North Korea, Cuba, Venezuela, and so on and so forth. Now, these sanctions, as an economist, these are having much bigger effect than anyone expected. In part because it turns out the reach of our financial regulatory regime is much deeper than anyone expected. You know, the Treasury this morning is encouraging people to buy Russian oil because there's been a buyer's strike on Russian oil. People don't want to touch it because they're worried that a couple of years from now, some regulator is going to come and shut them down because they touched someone who touched Russian oil. And it's really going to, from what I hear, since the Russians were unprepared for it in a way that the North Koreans know how to get around this, it is really going to hurt their economy in the next month or so. As one example, Boeing cut off access to the manuals for how do you fix a jet engine. That's all Russian airplanes are going to be on the ground in 3 weeks without that sort of. Even Russian factories need foreign imports, and we've essentially cut Russia off from all imports. So that's really going to hurt their economy. Does that hurt them in the long run once they find ways around it? And does that stop them from fighting a war? And I see a big tipping point if the government of Ukraine falls, and that back to HR is that in the cards in the next week or so. Once that happens, the chance for a good outcome, the outcome that we're hoping for, which is Russia goes back to its borders, and we tell the world you don't do this kind of stuff. Then that is much, much harder, much less. Then it's going to be just a question of how much do we surrender, a horrible negotiated outcome, and we go on to the next, which is, I fear, where we're going. So short version, sanctions very effective at hurting the Russian economy. Long version, I'm not sure sanctions are going to stop Russia's war-fighting ability in the next crucial month or so, where we find out if Ukraine stays alive. And you'll tell us more about history when we're doing the history party, Neil. I think so people are fantasizing Russia will overthrow Putin. Now, it might happen, and it would be wonderful if it did happen. But how much does hurting a civilian population really change political opinion? People were waiting for the Germans to overthrow Hitler for a long time. They tried a few times, but it never happened. The Germans thought that the Blitz was going to undermine civilian morale and cause the English to get rid of Churchill. That didn't happen. So I wouldn't put too much stock on sanctions as a warfighting strategy.
It's possible that the opposite could happen, right? That Putin will be successful in blaming others for his own aggression, and this is an aspect of the fight that I think is immensely important, which is the informational dimension and the need to reach the Russian people with alternative sources of information. And we ought to be doing everything that we can to do that, to counter his sustained campaign of disinformation and propaganda.
Well, HR, isn't that one of the schools of thought as to why we were releasing so much intelligence before the invasion, not just to get into Putin's head, but also to find ways to get to the Russian people to inform them that, hey, your country's about to invade another country?
Absolutely, to take away any of this false justification, to expose it as false. And I think the Biden administration should get really credit for that. And I think actually the UK government, Prime Minister Johnson, they did a very good job in the coordinated release of intelligence. And if you look at what Secretary Blinken did in the UN, he just read out, here's what they're going to do, and he just summarized everything that the Russians were about to do. And I think that obviously was insufficient to deter an attack, but I think it's very important such that Putin, I hope, will continue to lose any kind of support he has internationally. And just I want to ask maybe Neil and John a comment on this. I think it has been actually pretty heartening to see how Europe has shifted its views, especially Germany. But then also it's been a bit disheartening, right, to see some of our friends internationally, for example, not vote in favor of the UN Security Council resolution. I'm talking about India, United Arab Emirates, for example. So I think there's still work to be done to galvanize kind of the world against Russia. But overall, I think the picture has been quite positive in terms of the international response. We ought to point out, hey, Putin wanted disunity, and I think what he's getting is a lot of unity across the free world, and especially across Europe, the transatlantic relationship with our allies in Asia. And I hope that is sending some kind of a message to him that this isn't going to work. He's not going to be able. It's possible, right, that both sides lose here, right? The Ukrainian people are losing, obviously, in terms of the horrors that they're enduring and the loss and suffering they're enduring. But again, this is what I mean when I say Russia can't win. Russia's going to lose in this in terms of the objectives that it had in mind from the outset.
Well, Russia, they're going to destroy Ukraine and sit there. Now, one question for sanctions is how long we're going to keep up. There's this rush of patriotism now, as there is, and I agree, amazing to see the West come together. But when it comes to next winter and it's really cold in Germany, we'll see how long sanctions usually last for a while, and Russia will figure out how to get around them. So that's why I'm dubious about sanctions as the long-term strategy.
I want to say two things. First, I really cannot overstate my amazement and admiration for President Volodymyr Zelensky, who has proved a most unlikely but most effective war leader. I've met Zelensky. He's a most engaging person, but he's from the entertainment business. He's a comedian, an entertainer, a gifted one. And the story of his coming to power is one of the most unlikely of modern times. It's a kind of postmodern story where a man who plays an ordinary guy who becomes president then becomes president. And who would have predicted that he, of all people, would be such an inspiring war leader and so expert in information warfare that he's absolutely outsmarted Putin. It's been truly inspiring. But there are groups of mercenaries and special forces trying to kill him right now. He's surviving assassination attempts on a daily basis. And we need to be realistic here. No matter how inspiring his Facebook posts, and no matter how many emotionally charged things we say in support of Zelensky, fine words do not win wars. And we have to recognize that ultimately, strategically, we are, in fact, in a weaker position than anybody wants to admit. Think of the UN Security Council. Farcically, as war was breaking out, the Russians were chairing the UNSC. I mean, I watched those extraordinary scenes with my 10-year-old son, and he was incredulous. This is how the liberal international order works, Dad? Well, the answer is it doesn't work. So what are we left with? China is essentially underwriting and gave the green light to this operation. That gives it significant leverage. NATO is filled with righteous indignation and has committed itself to a significant increase in European defense spending, starting with Germany. But it very possibly now will have to deploy significant forces to the Baltic states, to Poland. And so we're kind of back in Cold War II, which most Europeans certainly didn't expect to be. And here's the real strategic worry to me. This is not just about the European theater. Even as all of this is going on, the Biden administration is cutting a very sweet deal from the Iranian point of view to resuscitate the Iran nuclear deal. They're making all kinds of concessions to Iran. Why? For the same reason, John, that they want us to buy Russian oil, because inflation is their number one fear ahead of the midterms. So there's this strange subplot going on in the Middle East, the consequences of which no one can foresee. But for sure, the Arabs and Israelis are not pleased to see what is going on in Vienna. And then finally, we are creating a profound dilemma for our policy in the Far East. Because whatever else happens, the Chinese now know we don't fight when countries get invaded by big authoritarian neighbors. We do sanctions. They're looking at Taiwan and saying, probably an easier fight than Ukraine if we can get our troops ashore. The Taiwanese are not the Ukrainians when it comes to house fighting, I can tell you that. But what do we do if they make a move on Taiwan next year? Sanctions? Does anybody seriously think we can do the kind of sanctions to China that we just did to Russia? Forget about it. It would be self-harm in terms of the blowback for our economy. So once again, fine words, emotive speeches, hats off to Zelensky. But we don't have a strategy for Cold War II.
Well,
That's what's clear.
we need to get one, right? We need to get a strategy. And so I think this idea that the international community will work together to promote harmony and peace. Okay, let's put that in the bag, right? That's not going to happen. Let's get rid of this idea that great power competition is a relic of the past. We're late to the game in all of this recognition. But what else can we learn about this? We have to learn that really hard power counts. As you mentioned, Neil, what should we have done since 2014 to build up Ukraine's defenses? And I'll tell you a story sometime, maybe over a cocktail, about how we got and helped President Trump, make the decision to provide defensive capabilities to Ukraine in 2017, without which they'd really be screwed right now. And then, I think we need to build up our defense capabilities. We've been operating under this assumption, right, that we can only just deal with one crisis at a time. But as we've talked about, and what you're alluding to in bringing the Middle East and the Iran nuclear deal into this, and the situation in Asia, is that we are set up right now for cascading crises. And I think we're set up, and this goes back to one of our earlier discussions, I think because of a perception that we lack the will to really do anything about anything. And this goes back to the disastrous surrender and withdraw in Afghanistan. And I think you can draw a direct line from that to in August is when Putin published this 6,000 word essay that Ukraine doesn't have any right to exist. It has no national identity of its own. That's when he decided to invade, was exactly at the moment when he was witnessing the humiliating withdrawal from Afghanistan. And you're right, I think, to bring China into this picture. China, as you said at the outset, right, they're posing as a peacemaker now. We can't let them get away with this. This is one of the reasons why, obviously, Russia can't succeed in Ukraine because of the second and third order effects. But we can't let Xi Jinping have it both ways, to now portray himself as a peacemaker and to call on all sides. I mean, this is the guy who stood with Putin before the Olympics and talked about a new era of international relations, which meant Putin and Xi Jinping, two authoritarian dictators on the Eurasian landmass, were going to reshape the world in their favor. That's what they set out as their joint agenda. We've got to hang that on his neck. And as you're saying, well, we wouldn't put the sanctions on China like we did on Russia. Well, we got to decouple on our own terms, because Xi Jinping, as you know, and John knows, that's what he wants. He wants to insulate himself from any kind of economic ramifications for his aggression, and he's in a race to do that. Well, we have to deny him the ability to do that through restrictions on investments and export controls and so forth. But then we have to get rid of this artificiality of so much of the world's manufacturing being concentrated on the southeastern coast of China. How did we let that happen? And it's part of the assumptions that we made, right? We're going to have a global community. How's that working out? Global community. And we can bias our supply chains in favor of efficiency rather than resilience. So there are a lot of economic adjustments. And John, I'd love to hear what you think about this, that are long-term. And I know that, that you're a free market economist, but hey, geopolitics, right, has gotten in the way of that. What do we do now? In terms of a long-term economic strategy?
We'll fight that one some other day. Our question is, in the next 3 years, what stops Xi Jinping from taking over Taiwan? Right. And you can have as much industrial policy as you want and build stuff at 3 times the cost in the U.S. than China. That's not going to make a dent in that decision. We talk about reducing
China's coercive power over us and others, because this is what Putin was banking on, is that him supplying 51% of Germany's natural gas and 41% of its oil. That's why he felt like, hey, they're going to let me get away with this.
And let's hope the disaster of our energy policies and Europe's is one of the good things that comes out of this.
Absolutely.
Raising defense spending.
John, let me just make a plug here. There are 6 actions sitting at the Department of Energy right now that have had full environmental impact work done. They've been sitting there for a year. All they need is a signature to rapidly increase U.S. infrastructure for export of natural gas. Okay, why are they sitting in the Department of Energy right now?
To say nothing of banning fracking on federal lands, canceling Keystone Pipeline, all the European things. But you mentioned defense spending. I added up the numbers. NATO together spends 20 times on defense what Russia spends. So it's really not about the spending. It's about the will to use it.
Right.
We have this immense military juggernaut. We could have stopped Russia at the border easily. If we had just sold Ukraine the weapons they wanted, advanced weapons, they could have stopped. It turns out they could have stopped Russia at the border if we needed. I think for the near-term future of Taiwan, the real question is what stops Xi Jinping from invading? And long-term economic adjustments aren't going to make that difference. And so this is what I want to ask you guys. Where does this go? How does this end? What is a long-run strategy for the U.S.? I can't see any way, but Putin destroys most of Ukraine. The current Ukrainian government, God help them to stay in one piece, but at best they're reduced to half of the country, or they're destroyed. They're out of power, in which case we have a bloody mess on our hands. Then we sit down at the negotiating table, and Putin gets some of it. His economy's in a mess, but nonetheless he gets some of it. We discuss slowly how we remove the sanctions, and that's kind of where we sit for a long time. Where is a path to what has to happen, that this doesn't work at all, that Ukraine is back to a sovereign country in the borders that we guaranteed in 1994. And maybe there's a nice way to put this. Where is the off-ramp? Many times in history, we have failed by not allowing the other side some sort of vaguely face-saving off-ramp. The guy's got nuclear weapons, so it's not going to be unconditional surrender like it was in World War II. I'm afraid that the off-ramps involve Chinese negotiations and a commission that 3 years from now certifies the partition of Ukraine and the power of China. But do you guys have any great thoughts on given the mess?
I want Neil to answer this. I'm just going to tee up Neil's answer by saying, I think you go, obviously, as historians, we would say we can go to history to see what kind of what some of the outcomes could be. I mean, does Ukraine become Cyprus? Does it become Georgia after the 2008 invasion in terms of another frozen conflict and some kind of a partition? Does it though become what we would hope is Montenegro when it was invaded by the Ottomans in the 1870s? And all the odds were against the Montenegrins, but they fought like hell, and the Ottomans withdrew. So that's what we would hope for. I think I don't know if that's going to happen, because that would depend, I think, on the scenario that we've discussed and said that nobody can predict, is what's going to happen to Vladimir Putin. Right? What's going to happen?
Leaving it to the Ukrainians to fight a partisan war is calling for the utter destruction and bloodbath of the country. I mean,
it's a bloodbath for the Russians. I'm telling you, John. Look at the scale on the map. Look at the scale on the map. Look at the amount of force that they have committed. They can't do it. They can't secure the country. Now, what they can do is they can bomb the crap out of them forever. They can inflict massive casualties, and this is why control of the air is so important. And the blog post that you just had recently is so good, because you got right to the heart of the issue. I mean, really, Russia's competitive advantage right now is control of the aerospace and the maritime domains. And if they lost that, I mean, the Ukrainians would really have a fighting chance. But I'm telling you, the Russians cannot control all of that territory. It's impossible with not only the forces they have, but I think with additional forces they would mobilize.
Right, Neil.
Can we do some history here? Because what we're revealing is how incredibly difficult it is to foresee the future in a situation like this. There's no model from political science that can help you here. All you have to go on is history. So let's apply some history. We know that really from the beginning of the 18th century, with only relatively brief intervals, Ukraine was a part of the Russian Empire. We also know from his own statements that Putin thinks much more of resuscitating the tsarist empire than of resuscitating the Soviet Union. And in a way, it's revealing that his hero is Peter the Great, and that Peter the Great's decisive victory that established Russia as a European great power was in Ukraine, at Poltava in 1709. So historically, it's in the ballpark of likelihood that Russia gets Ukraine back into its historic sphere of influence, because it would be very unusual. It would be a departure from hundreds of years of history if Ukraine succeeded, as its people have tried to do, in becoming a Western-orientated independent country run with democratic institutions, a member of the European Union and of NATO. That was the Ukrainian goal, and Russia has twice used military force to prevent it, in 2014 and now. So I think one has to assume that from a historical point of view, the balance of probability is that Ukraine doesn't make it out of Russia's embrace. Russia in the 19th century, on more than one occasion, used harsh, brutal methods to impose its control, not just on Ukraine, but on Poland. And I can imagine from the example of history that we go through one of those periods when Russia's a pariah and everybody hates on Russia. That happened in the 1830s. It was a feature of the Cold War. I can see that happening. I can see a situation in which they don't really have full control of Ukraine, but they're able to prevent Ukraine achieving its Westernization goal. There's a difference, though, and John just alluded to it. There's a reason we're not in the 19th century, and that is nuclear weapons. To me, the most significant thing that has happened in the last 2 weeks is that a very slight threat of the use of nuclear weapons caused NATO to back off. And Putin has understood something very important. If we are in a new Cold War, we, the other side, the Western side, aren't really serious because we're not really prepared to meet nuclear threat with nuclear threat. When Putin mentioned the possibility of using tactical nuclear weapons, the idea of lending the Ukrainians fighter jets from NATO countries was off the table within a matter of days. It also took off the table any idea of an air exclusion zone. So crucially, whatever 19th century fantasies Putin is indulging in, we are in some ways back in Cold War. We're back in a situation that we were in the early Cold War, with one important difference. Today, China's the senior partner and Russia's the junior partner, whereas in the late 1940s, it was the other way around. In the 1950s, a hot war broke out, but it was in Asia, it was in Korea. And we were able to intervene militarily in that war, even with a UN Security Council resolution. Whereas now, the war is in Europe, and there seems to be zero probability that we intervene militarily beyond supplying the Ukrainians with hardware. But I think the big takeaway is that we're in Cold War II, but in this Cold War, we're not prepared to use nuclear deterrence against the Russians, and they're prepared to use it against us.
Well, I'll just say, go ahead, John.
Quickly, gentlemen, we're out of time.
We just rewrote the rules. The rules used to be nuclear weapons are there, and we don't invade and overthrow another country that has nuclear weapons, but you can fight in third places. And the rules are now, if I invade a third country, and then I threaten nuclear weapons in a third country, that you have to back off. And we have just acceded to those rules.
Okay, HR, the final word, then we're going to go.
Yeah, I'll just say, hey, the nuclear part of this is something that's very important, not only in connection with the invasion of Ukraine, but also the threat of proliferation. We are right now supplicating to the Iranians and are in pursuit of an extremely weak nuclear deal that will give them cover for continuing their nuclear program, and it'll give them more resources to intensify their proxy war against their neighbors and to threaten Israel with destruction. So I think we need to really learn from this situation and also understand what others are going to learn from it and try to apply. And I think the lesson is you need a bomb, and that's going to be a much more dangerous world.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. We will be meeting again in about 100 hours from now, Tuesday of next week. Our guest on the next episode will be Congressman Mike Gallagher. He is a Republican from Wisconsin. He's a member of the House Armed Services Committee. He also served his country in the United States Marine Corps, deploying twice to Iraq. So he has some very interesting thoughts on not just what is going on in Ukraine, but also U.S. military involvement. So look for that episode very soon. On behalf of my colleagues, Niall Ferguson, HR McMaster, John Cochrane, all of us here at the Hoover Institution, we hope you enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for watching.
If you enjoyed this show and are interested in watching more content featuring HR McMaster, watch Battlegrounds, also available at hoover.org.